Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a couple of questions. How fragile is the Gaza ceasefire, and what happens next? Let's get to the bottom line. It was made to look like a huge celebration of peace in the Middle East, but so far, it's just a ceasefire agreement to end the war that tore the world apart. The official name of this deal signed last week in Egypt is President Donald J. Trump's comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. And right now, we're in phase one, which divides the Gaza Strip between Palestinian control and Israeli control. Hamas released all 20 of the living Israelis it was holding, and Israel released 2,000 of the 11,000 Palestinians it has been holding. Food, water, and medicine have finally started to trickle in, but not at the levels agreed to in the deal. The agreement has two more phases, but for now it's stuck in first gear, as Israeli forces have killed a number of Palestinians since the truce, and Israel argues that Hamas isn't doing enough to give back the remains of deceased Israeli captives. So what are the chances of getting to phase two or phase three, and how real are the fears that everything could fall apart? Today we're speaking with Israeli-American activist Gershon Baskin, the Middle East director of the International Communities Organization, and he's co-head of the Alliance for Two States. The last time we had a kind of Trump-brokered deal, it fell apart in 40 days. What are your predictions with this one?
I think this is different. I think this is the end of the war. It's going to be difficult to maintain the ceasefire. There are a lot of moving parts of things that have to happen very quickly. Some of them are already beginning to unfold. It was, for instance, announced the international assistance for Hamas to locate the bodies of deceased hostages are entering Gaza. A Turkish group entered the day before, an Egyptian group. There are going to be even American boots on the ground, so to speak, American experts coming in to work with Hamas. The Qataris are bringing heavy machinery. This is just one small part of what needs to happen, as both sides have been accusing each other of breaking the ceasefire. We can talk about the other steps that are immediately going to happen in the next days and the next weeks that will make this ceasefire hold.
What do you find different in this deal that may make it more resilient?
Well, I think it's, and we have to say it, as difficult it is to say, it's Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the big difference between this deal and every deal that happened before it. Donald Trump is a different element and a different form of diplomacy and negotiations than we've experienced before. He projects American power in a way that we probably haven't seen since Dwight Eisenhower. And everyone in the world, almost everyone in the world, perhaps with the exception of Putin and Xi, take him seriously and try to cater to his need for power and compliments and how wonderful he is. And there was a great consciousness in the part of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner that even though it's very clear that Hamas was decimated in this war, they had to come away with some kind of win. They had to come away with a sense that they were getting something as well from the deal. And those are the kind of things that deal makers put into the pie when they're baking it. And this is what they did.
I'm going to play you a clip from President Trump. It kind of addresses some of the fragility in this deal as each side sees it. And I want to get your opinion. Let's listen.
It's a gruesome process. I almost hate to talk about it. But they're digging. They're actually digging. There are areas where they're digging and they're finding a lot of bodies. Then they have to separate the bodies. You wouldn't believe this. And some of those bodies have been in there a long time. And some of them are under rubble. They have to remove rubble.
To me, it sounds like President Trump is sympathizing with the Hamas side of the equation, saying give it time to work, move it forward. But it raises this interesting question of how fragile or how quickly each side is going to jump to declare the other one in violation of the treaty.
Yeah, definitely. Immediately after the return of the living hostages, the 20 living hostages, when Hamas was supposed to begin returning 28 of the deceased hostages, and they were not responding. We didn't know how many were going to be returning. We didn't know who they were. The Israeli side was already talking about Hamas breaching the deal. I sent a quick note to Mr. Witkoff saying that there's the drums of war are beating in Israel already, saying that Hamas is derailing the agreement. They're not taking the responsibility of returning the bodies seriously. Hamas was already accusing Israel of breaching the deal. There were people who were killed by the Israeli army. And I highlighted to Witkoff that he has to keep his finger on the pulse, and they have to weigh in very quickly, because we have a history of Israelis and Palestinians making agreements and breaching them. During the Oslo peace process, the Israeli government and the PLO signed 6 agreements and breached every single one of them. If the Americans want this to work, and apparently they want it to work, they're going to have to be engaged every single day, several times a day, to tell the mediators and to tell the parties, Israel and Hamas, that both sides are honoring the agreement. We had the United States come out officially saying that Hamas is not breaching the agreement, that there are objective difficulties. They include the fact that Hamas only controls 50% of the territory. There might be bodies buried on the side where Israel's controlling. Hamas doesn't have a forensic lab. They don't have the heavy machinery to dig under the rubble of buildings. There are thousands of Gazans unaccounted for who were killed in buildings that Israel bombed during the 2 years of the war. And it's very likely that there are Israeli hostages under the rubble of those buildings or in tunnels that Israel destroyed. So this is going to take time. The experts are coming. They built an international mechanism into the agreement for the express purpose of making sure that Hamas is devoting 100% effort to doing it while they're bringing in experts who can assist. But we also have to understand that there may be bodies of the deceased hostages that will not be recovered. And we still have to maintain the ceasefire. There's a lot of work to do. Sorry, there needs to be a new Palestinian government instated for Gaza, a temporary government immediately. There are 1,000 trained Palestinian police personnel who have been trained in Jordan and Egypt over the last months who are ready to be deployed the moment there's a new Palestinian government. Next week, Steve Witkoff will be appearing before the United Nations Security Council with a U.S.-sponsored proposed United Nations Security Council resolution to embody the whole agreement in international legitimacy and international law, which will give the mandate for the stabilization force, this multinational force that will be sent to the Gaza Strip, including troops from Arab countries and other Muslim countries and European countries. There'll be a contingent of 200 American troops who will be stationed outside the Gaza Strip on the Israeli side and the Egyptian side to help. There are billions of dollars being raised now to begin the reconstruction of Gaza. We have winter coming, 2 million homeless people in Gaza who don't have a roof over their head. They don't have electricity or water or food. There is so much work to do at the same time with great urgency. And I think everyone realizes this in order to make this agreement stick.
Gershon, are you interacting with Steve Witkoff? Does he read your memos and notes and respond to them?
Every day. So
that's remarkable. You're the first person I know who's had that kind of regular relationship with Steve Witkoff. And you just described a very, I think, intricate set of issues that he's going to be dealing with, the legitimacy around this argument. But I would ask you, what do you think is his North Star in these negotiations? How did he get to where he did?
Look, also the story of how I met him, my Palestinian partner, Samer Senjalawi, in December, just after he was appointed, a month before he entered the White House, he noted that he was going to be a keynote speaker at a Bitcoin conference in Abu Dhabi that Eric Trump was also going to speak with. And Samer suggested that we fly out to Abu Dhabi, register for the conference, and try to meet the guy. And that's what we did. We actually, he was in a part of the conference for the high payers. I think it was a $10,000 per person entry fee. But we stood outside that area. We noticed when he got up and went to the men's room, and we followed him and caught him as he was coming out of the men's room. And that was how I introduced myself to him and started communicating with him. I found what was very interesting about him. He's the first U.S. presidential envoy to the Middle East who was not Israel focused. Witkoff, although he's a New York Jewish businessman, real estate guy, his investments were in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. That's where he was doing business these last years. He only really met Israel since he took the job, and I must say he's learned to appreciate the Israeli people. He was very strongly connected to the hostage families. He knows everyone in Israel, and although he didn't know the issues and didn't know the personalities when he started, he's a very fast learner. He's a very capable negotiator. He's smart, and he knows how to read people, and he's a tough negotiator. I mean, he has a Trumpian style of negotiation that you put the deal on the table with a pistol next to it, and you tell people there's a deadline, make a decision. I'm simplifying it a bit, but that's the style of negotiations that we face now in this Trump era.
We've never seen a U.S. president, not Barack Obama, not Joe Biden, and others really successfully contain Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu well enough to get him to something, and Netanyahu would essentially undermine everything pretty quickly that they had agreed. So there's something different about this calculus. You're arguing, and I think, you know.
For months, I was telling Hamas, since Trump entered the Oval Office, I was telling the leadership in Hamas that you need to understand you're not negotiating with Israel. Every time I raised a proposal and suggested something, their response would be, but Israel won't agree. And I kept telling them, you're not negotiating with Israel. Israel will say no to every proposal. Israel wants to continue the war. Netanyahu, his political survival is based on continuing the war. What I kept telling the Hamas leadership is, you have to imagine that you're sitting in the room across the table from Donald Trump. That's the person you're negotiating with. It's very strange for me because I've been talking to Hamas for 18 years now, negotiating with them. And I was always referring to the Israeli side. I was talking to the Israeli officials in the Ministry of Defense, in the Israeli army, in the Shin Bet. And over the last months, I haven't interacted with the Israelis at all because the focus was America. I kept telling the Hamas people, and I kept telling Witkoff, that the only way this war is going to end is when Donald Trump decides to end it. What happened was when he took the office and he first met with Netanyahu, I was expecting Trump to impose the end of the war on Netanyahu then, but instead what happened is Netanyahu convinced Trump that Israel could bring Hamas to its knees. Israel could be defeated, Hamas will surrender. In fact, I had a number of discussions like this with Witkoff, where Witkoff was saying, yes, Hamas can be brought to surrender. And he gave different examples of other cases where the enemy was brought to surrender. And I contended that Hamas will never surrender. Hamas was willing to fight to the last Gaza, and they would never surrender. It's not part of their DNA. It's not part of the way they think. It's not part of their religious beliefs. In their religious beliefs, the ultimate task in life is to die as a martyr for Palestine, for Allah, for Islam, etc. And you can't make someone surrender in that case. After Doha, just before Doha, Ghazi Hamid from Hamas and I had negotiated a paper of 8 points to end the war, and Witkoff approved it and told me, and Hamas wanted to receive it from the Qatari prime minister. So Witkoff told me that they were going to receive it from the Qatari minister. And on the 5th or 6th of September, the Hamas went to meet with the Qataris, and the Qataris gave them a 5-point document that looked like Netanyahu's demands for ending the war. And the Hamas asked the Qatari prime minister, what about the 8-point document? And they were told that the 8-point document are American ideas, but the 5-point document is the official one. They came back to me from Hamas and said, we're confused. There are 2 documents. If we know about the 8-point document, we can agree to the 8-point document. The 5-point document is Netanyahu's. We won't agree to that. And I contacted Witkoff. It was when he was sitting next to the president at the tennis tournament. I turned on CNN and I saw Witkoff with his phone WhatsApping me. I told Witkoff there are 2 documents. Witkoff told me, tell Hamas to agree to the 8-point, and we'll get Israel to be online with that. So I told that to Hamas, but they went back to the Qataris and they said, no, there's only the 5-point document. On the 8th in the evening, September 8th in the evening, Witkoff called me and told me the Hamas team is receiving, as we talk, the latest and final version of the American proposal. We expect an answer from them in the coming days. He said, tell Hamas that we want an answer from them on this new document. This is the last and final. There won't be another. I relayed that to the Hamas people also. And the next day, Israel did the assassination attempt in Doha. I immediately contacted Witkoff and I said to him, you know, Steve, there's not a person in the world, definitely not in the region, who doesn't think that Trump gave the green light for this. Israel wouldn't have done it without a green light from Trump. He had immediately responded that we had nothing to do with it. We didn't know about it. We condemn it. We're dissociating ourselves from it. We're very angry at Israel. Tell this to the Hamas people. Well, on the 10th, one of the Hamas leaders, not Ghazi Hamid, someone else contacted me and said that they've been instructed by the Qataris to not go out, to shut their phones. And he was telling me that I wouldn't hear from them. I kept sending messages. I noticed that some of the messages were being read, but they would immediately shut their phone. Witkoff had said that Trump will be posting in his Truth Social the condemnation of the attack by Israel and the dissociation of the United States from the attack. But about a week later, I got a message from Hamas saying that we can't trust the Americans. You told us that we have to negotiate with the Americans, that the Americans will guarantee the end of the war. If we release the hostages, Israel won't start it again. But how can we believe the Americans when they authorized the attack to kill us? And that was a very good point. And I relayed that back to the United States, back to Witkoff and his team. About a week later, something like that, Witkoff sent me a WhatsApp saying, we have a plan. And the plan was the 21 points that Trump posted on his Truth Social. He called the Arab countries to agree to it, and Muslim countries and European countries. And then he ordered Netanyahu to come to Washington to the Oval Office after the General Assembly meeting when Netanyahu spoke to an empty room. And on camera, Trump humiliated Benjamin Netanyahu and picked up the phone, gave the phone to Netanyahu, told him to call the Qatari prime minister and apologize. Trump completely scripted it, said every word that Netanyahu needed to say. And when the cameras and the journalists left the Oval Office, Trump turned to Bibi, to Netanyahu, and said, Bibi, the war is over. We're going to bring home all the hostages, but the war is over. You're going to end it now, and you're going to announce to the world that you agree to it. And of course, that's what Netanyahu did because he couldn't say no to Trump. Trump posted it on his Truth Social, which turns words into reality. And then the problem was locking Hamas into the deal, and he gave Hamas a deadline. Hamas came back with the yes, but answer. Trump ignored the but and published on his Truth Social that Hamas said yes. And to lock Hamas into the deal, he brought the Qataris, the Egyptians, and he called up Erdogan in Turkey and told Erdogan send his intelligence chief, Ibrahim Kalin, to go to Doha and to lock Hamas into the deal. And then they were all invited to Sharm el-Sheikh to finish it off.
I think what you just shared, Gershon, is going to go in the history books. You know, right now you've got an extraordinarily dense population, you know, the size of New Mexico squeezed into the city of Baltimore. And maybe those are the wrong metaphors, but it's just a lot of people dense. So as you kind of look at the withdrawal, you know, the Israeli force withdrawal from the lines, opening that up, one key piece of this is the phase two, and just your intricate knowledge of this. Can we ever see real movement to phase two of this agreement?
We're seeing it already, the deployment of the international assistance and finding the bodies, and there will be an announcement very soon about the new Palestinian government and who's going to head it and how it's going to work. The deployment of 1,000 Palestinian troops that have been trained over months in Jordan and Egypt will happen soon. They will be supplemented by other people from Gaza who will be brought in. Gaza will be governed by the Gazans. There will be the Security Council resolution and the deployment of the multinational force that will be coming to Gaza. The money will start flowing. This peace board that Trump talked about that he's going to be heading and Tony Blair will be part of, and other leaders have already said that they will be part of. Witkoff described it to me as kind of a receivership of a bankrupt company. So It's not going to be governing Gaza, but they'll be dealing with the finance. We're talking about billions of dollars.
So will the aid flow in that equation? Will the aid flow in that equation? Will the IDF pull out?
When Witkoff talked about a receivership, I think they were talking mostly about managing the aid money that's going to come in for reconstruction. The international aid, the humanitarian aid, is already flowing into Israel, into Gaza more freely. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation disappeared. Basically, they're not there anymore, which is what Witkoff told me would happen. And it's going to go back to the international organizations. The Rafah crossing is being rebuilt. It's going to be reopened for movement in two directions. We have to push on the Egyptians to allow Palestinians from Gaza to have the same right to enter Egypt that every other person in the world does, because until now, the siege or the blockade on Gaza was implemented both by Israel and Egypt, and that can't continue. And the Rafah crossing needs to be a crossing for goods and people, not just for goods, so that everything doesn't have to go through Israel. There will be a European mechanism at the Rafah crossing on the Gaza side to monitor and inspect and make sure that weapons and materials for producing weapons are not coming into Gaza. And that goes back to an agreement that existed in 2005 called the Rafah Crossing Agreement that involved the European Border Management Organization. So there'll be something remade like that, perhaps more robust, to ensure that there is no smuggling over that border. But all these things, as I said, these are a lot of moving pieces and they're all happening. You can only call these phase two. There's also an American guarantee to Hamas that when all these mechanisms are down and working, the new government, the Palestinian Security, the international stability force, that Israel will be forced to withdraw from Gaza entirely. There'll be a security perimeter around the Gaza border between 500 and 1,000 meters deep. That will be a no-entry zone, a shoot-to-kill zone. But my understanding is that that there won't be Israeli soldiers stationed in Gaza when this process moves forward and those other pieces are put into place.
In real short form, Gershon, this hasn't just been a Gaza story. We've seen incredible violence and displacement in the West Bank. What's happening in the West Bank? While we're all looking at this deal over in Gaza, what's happening with the West Bank scene?
Yeah, in the past 2 years of this war, more than 1,000 people were killed in Gaza, in the West Bank by Israel, by settlers and soldiers. 100 outposts have been built. 26 new settlements have been built. Palestinian communities have been evacuated in the Jordan Valley. The economy is in ruins. 200,000 Palestinians who used to work in Israel have been unemployed for 2 years. I was in Ramallah yesterday, and I looked at Ramallah, and it's really this amazing city, but it's all the cities in the West Bank and towns and villages. And I asked myself the question, why hasn't the West Bank exploded in this kind of violence that we know is the potential there, the kind of stuff we saw in the Second Intifada, for example? And my answer is because every person in the West Bank is looking at Gaza. People living in Ramallah or Nablus or Jenin or Tulkarem or Hebron are saying to themselves, do I want my town, my village, my city to look like Gaza? And the answer is no. So there's actually some form of very distasteful deterrence, which is keeping the West Bank relatively quiet. Obviously, it's not sustainable, and we need Trump to move forward in accepting that the only solution for this conflict is the two-state solution. And everyone needs to understand that Palestinians won't have freedom if Israelis don't have security, and Israel will never have security if Palestinians don't have freedom. The whole international move led by the Saudis and the French and others to recognize the Palestinian state don't change anything for Palestinians on the ground.
Right.
That will only happen when Israel recognizes the state of Palestine and the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. But this is all processes which are going to move forward and put pressure on Israel. And let's not forget the isolation that Israel is already facing, the war crimes that Israel committed in Gaza, the accusations of genocide, which concur with the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide, are all very serious. And when Gaza is opened up to the international media and people see the reality of Gaza, Israel is going to be hit really hard. And the Israeli people are going to have to understand that there are consequences for what Israel did. Just as Hamas is forcing the Palestinian people to understand the consequences of what Hamas did to the Palestinian people. This is going to go on both sides. And Israel is going to face a very difficult period in the near future when the world sees dramatically, when there are journalists on the ground in Gaza, it's not going to be so simple. The Israeli public is going to have to deal with, and I think they will. I think there will be an awakening in Israel that we can't keep doing this. Something has to change.
Well, I could talk to you for
continuation of war and military strategies doesn't work anymore.
Thank you very much for your observations. Israeli-American activist Gershon Baskin, co-founder of the Alliance for Two States. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur of the occupied Palestinian territories, may have said it best. You cease, I fire. Trump's New Deal for the Middle East just doesn't give much agency to the Palestinians, but it gives a lot of leeway to Israel to proceed at its own pace. The U.S. is still treating really deep bleeding wounds between these peoples with Band-Aids and Tylenol. So it's easy to predict that we're going to continue to see an ongoing Palestinian-Israeli crisis with no end in sight. War is easy. Peace is really hard. But if there is a glimmer of hope for a better future, it's the fact that the U.S. finally, after decades of monopolizing Middle East conflict resolution, knowing that it wasn't an honest broker, finally was forced to internationalize this issue. Now we have Muslim, non-Arab countries like Indonesia and Pakistan, and especially Turkey, deeply involved. So maybe the balance of power is shifting, and maybe things really can start to change. And that's the bottom line.